You are standing in the middle of a crowded room. People are laughing, talking, and enjoying the music. You just finished telling a story to a small group of acquaintances. As you walk away to get a drink, you notice two of them lean in and whisper to each other. Instantly, your stomach drops. Your heart rate accelerates. A frantic, overwhelming need to know what they are saying completely hijacks your brain. You spend the rest of the evening agonizing over the interaction. You review every word you said, the tone of your voice, and the way you were standing. You feel a familiar, quiet desperation settle into your chest. You need to know what they think of you. Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic, cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors, which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects, which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel insecure, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path, but walk in the same direction every day, and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the untouched woods around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits, or that your struggles are entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to obsess over the opinions of others, you can begin to teach it something else. You are preparing to send an important email to your boss. You write the email in 5 minutes. Then you spend 4 to 5 minutes rewriting it. You change the punctuation, delete exclamation marks so you don't sound too eager, and add them back so you don't sound angry. You send screenshots to a friend to ask if it sounds professional. And strangely, the hardest part isn't writing the email. It is the immediate visceral panic that arises when you realize the recipient's reaction is entirely out of your control. Maybe you call yourself a perfectionist. Maybe you think you simply have high standards for communication. Maybe you've started believing that being highly analytical is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally articulate. This is where the psychology of hypervigilance and social threat detection becomes interesting. For many, the need to manage how others perceive them is a survival mechanism. Anticipating criticism before it happens creates an immediate illusion of control over a volatile social environment, and that illusion can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate obsessive monitoring with safety. The problem is that what protects you from a potential misunderstanding today can make the act of simply being yourself feel incredibly dangerous tomorrow. You might see this bleed into your daily life. You constantly apologize for things that aren't your fault, or you relentlessly rehearse conversations in the shower before they happen. It is like driving a car while exclusively staring at the rearview mirror, terrified of what the cars behind you are doing. At first, you think you are just being a defensive driver, but eventually, you crash because you aren't looking at the road ahead. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we communicate. They change our fundamental willingness to exist without an audience's approval. If you repeatedly obsess over how you are perceived to avoid judgment, you may gradually become more comfortable with anxiety than authenticity. If you repeatedly edit yourself to fit someone else's expectations, Speaking your truth may begin to feel less like a right and more like a massive risk. If you repeatedly practice performing for others, your own internal voice may begin to feel entirely foreign. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you in a highly critical childhood environment. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today, and what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually lack confidence. Maybe you've simply trained yourself to use hypervigilance as a respectable excuse to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of simply being seen. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced sending an email without reading it 5 times for the next year, what might become easier? You post a photo or an opinion on social media. It is something you genuinely like or care about. Within 10 minutes, you notice that it hasn't received many likes, or worse, someone leaves a mildly critical comment. You instantly feel a wave of humiliation. You delete the post. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the lack of validation. It's the immediate, brutal shift in your own opinion. You suddenly hate the thing you loved simply because someone else didn't applaud it. Maybe you call yourself adaptable. Maybe you think you're simply open to feedback and willing to change your mind. Maybe you've started believing that being highly sensitive to the room is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally open-minded. This is where the psychology of an external locus of identity and self-monitoring becomes relevant. When you lack a solid internal foundation, you outsource your identity to the crowd. Adjusting your opinions to match the crowd creates a massive, immediate sense of belonging. And that belonging can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate conformity with guaranteed safety from rejection. The problem is that what gives you relief from social isolation today can make your own internal compass feel entirely broken tomorrow. You might find yourself totally changing your music taste, your political views, or your hobbies depending on who you are dating. It is like being a thermostat that only measures the temperature of the house next door. At first, it feels empathetic, but eventually, your own house freezes over. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we like. They change what we naturally consider ourselves allowed to value. If you repeatedly abandon your own preferences to secure approval, you may gradually become more comfortable with self-betrayal than social friction. If you repeatedly let the crowd dictate your worth, standing alone may begin to feel less like independence and more like a terrifying exile. If you repeatedly practice shaping yourself to fit the mold, your true shape may be lost forever. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have saved you from bullying in middle school. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally indecisive. Maybe you've simply practiced preemptively erasing yourself so no one gets the chance to reject you. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced leaving a post up even if no one liked it for the next year, what might become easier? Notice what is happening here. None of these behaviors look powerful. They look like passing thoughts. That's precisely why they are powerful. The things that shape us are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are the things we repeat so often that we stop noticing them entirely. By this point, you might be noticing something uncomfortable. Most of these behaviors, the rehearsing, the conforming, the monitoring, don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel like you. That's the strange thing about repetition. At first, you choose the behavior. Eventually, the behavior can begin choosing for you. But a habit can influence your personality without defining your identity. Recognizing a pattern is not a reason to shame yourself. It is a reason to become more conscious of it. You are invited to a party. You want to go, but you realize that a specific acquaintance will be there. Someone who has always been slightly passive-aggressive toward you. Instead of going and ignoring them, you decide to stay home. You convince yourself you are just tired. And strangely, the hardest part isn't missing the party. It's how quickly you were willing to sacrifice your own joy to avoid the discomfort of someone else's disapproval. Maybe you call yourself an introvert. Maybe you think you're simply protecting your peace and avoiding toxic energy. Maybe you've started believing that avoiding crowds is just your personality. But this is not because you are naturally antisocial. This is where the psychology of social anxiety and the spotlight effect comes into play. The spotlight effect is the psychological bias where we overestimate how much people notice our behavior and appearance. Staying home creates immediate relief from the perceived spotlight, and that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate avoidance with the preservation of your emotional energy. The problem is that what keeps your energy intact today can guarantee chronic internal isolation tomorrow. You might notice yourself taking the long way to the bathroom at work just to avoid walking past a certain coworker. It is like building a massive, heavy iron fortress to protect a single fragile flower. It is incredibly effective for keeping the flower safe. But if the walls are too thick, the flower never gets any sunlight. It dies anyway. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change where we go. They change whose life we are actually allowing to dictate our movements. If you repeatedly shrink your world to avoid disapproval, you may gradually become more comfortable with loneliness than vulnerability. If you repeatedly let the presence of one critic ruin your environment, enjoying yourself may begin to feel humiliating. If you repeatedly practice hiding from judgment, stepping into the light may begin to feel like a threat to your survival. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept you away from genuinely harmful situations in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally reclusive. Maybe you've practiced prioritizing everyone else's potential judgment over your own actual experience. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced walking into a room knowing someone there dislikes you for the next year, what might become easier? You make a mistake. It is a minor error at work or a slightly awkward comment at a dinner party. Most people would forget it in 10 minutes, but you spend the next 3 days analyzing it. You try to read the facial expressions of everyone involved. You ask your friends for reassurance. You desperately need them to tell you that you are not a bad person. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the mistake itself. It's the terrifying suspicion that a single flaw has permanently ruined your entire reputation. Maybe you call yourself self-aware. Maybe you think you're simply holding yourself accountable and striving for growth. Maybe you've started believing that intense rumination is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally conscientious. This is where the psychology of rumination and reassurance seeking becomes profound. We mistakenly believe that thinking endlessly about a problem will solve it. Psychologically, seeking reassurance creates a temporary, fleeting sense of security. Getting that reassurance immediately teaches the brain something. The brain begins to associate external validation with internal peace. The problem is that what makes you feel secure today can completely divorce you from the ability to self-soothe tomorrow. You might find yourself unable to sleep because you are replaying a conversation from 5 years ago. Imagine having a smoke detector that goes off every time you light a candle. It doesn't change much at first. Let it go off every day for years, however, and eventually you may stop cooking altogether. You may start believing the house is constantly on fire. The repetition has become automatic. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we process mistakes. They change how we define our fundamental right to be imperfect. If you repeatedly seek external reassurance to survive a mistake, You may gradually become more comfortable with panic than self-compassion. If you repeatedly mistake rumination for problem solving, letting an awkward moment go may begin to feel less like a relief and more like a dangerous oversight. If you repeatedly practice putting your self-worth on trial, the jury will always find you guilty. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped you avoid repeating serious mistakes. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today, and what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually need more reassurance. Maybe you've aggressively practiced using rumination as a respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of simply forgiving yourself. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced letting a mistake remain unanalyzed for the next year, what might become easier? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view people-pleasing as a virtue. We assume that caring deeply about what everyone thinks is the ultimate sign of empathy. But understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your audience. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become an arrogant, careless person. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing these habits does not instantly teleport you to a place of perfect confidence, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. Why does any of this matter? Because the small choices you make every single day are quietly building the architecture of your future mind. One day doesn't define you. One edited email doesn't define you. One deleted post doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The quiet ways you edit your personality, the subtle ways you mirror the crowd, the invisible ways you shrink to avoid judgment. These are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated, and repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? Are you practicing surveillance, or are you practicing freedom? You are allowed to rewrite the script. You are allowed to let people misunderstand you. You are allowed to be delightfully messy and unapologetically yourself. Because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally not caring. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and inevitably in the things you do again tomorrow.